Hi guys. Well, we are into our new study through Ruth, week 1 this week, looking at chapter 1 verses 1 to 5. It's a bit of an introduction to the story, full of hints and clues to help us understand more about what the message, what the big themes of this book are. So let's jump in. We're going to do 8 weeks through the book. I think that's a good time to sort of try and suck the marrow out of the story. I'm sure you may have read the book before. You have some ideas about what it's about. Hopefully we can build on that as we go through it. So kind of set the scene, provide us a bit of a metaphor to help us with this opening session. I do not have very good ball skills. And unfortunately, I grew up in a country which placed a high social value on sport, probably not unlike Australia. And so it was hard times for Roger for the first 14 years at least of my life, because I could not catch or bowl or punt or drop kick satisfactorily. And so I grew up on the bottom steps of the social ladder, so to speak. But things took a bit of a turn for the good, for the better, when I reached high school, because there was a sport available which did not require as much hand-eye coordination, and so I became a rower. And the school I went to is an all-boys school, very proud of its kind of old school heritage. And so a part of signing up to be a part of the rowing club meant subjecting yourself to what we called initiation. I assume many people had the same experience if you were at school 20 years ago in Australia. And so the senior guys in the club would, in that first year of membership, would take every opportunity to put you in your place and to turn the screws and to send you on all sorts of ridiculous missions, which were intended to be hard and intended to push you to your limits and frustrate you a lot of the time. Anyway, one of these traditions was to make all of the year 8s, that's the 14-year-olds, swim across the river. We would run down to the river after school and then do our training on this river, which was in town. It was quite a large river that ended in a port that went out to sea. And so one of the initiation tasks for all year 8s was to swim across the river, fetch a rock on the other side of your choosing, and then to bring the rock back to the other side of the river dry. Little twist at the end, which upped the ante a bit. I think I've got a picture up on screen at the moment. You'll see this is the actual river with the big bridge across, and then on the right hand side is our clubhouse, and we swam from there directly across. Anyway, not that important, but because it was a river port going out to sea, there was always a significant tide to navigate in the river, whether you were swimming or rowing for that matter. And I remember on the day we swam across to get our rocks, ending up much further downstream than I'd planned when I popped out on the other side of the river. And then having to very awkwardly, after finding a rock, kind of clamber my way back up the bank, knowing that if I swam back, I was going to get washed down again, especially now swimming with one hand in the air, trying to keep my rock safe from the water. I'm sure that you also know what that feels like, swimming in a tide. It's not to say that when you're in the tide and when you're in that current that you have no agency. You can swim. You can aim for a point on the bank. You can flail and you can kick and you can do your thing, and you can change your position. But ultimately, when you land on the other side, you invariably don't get to where you thought you were going to get to, because the whole tide, the water around you is moving you up or downstream, depending on the day. And I'm sure you've also had that experience at the beach when you stand up and you look and the lifeguards gesticulating wildly because you're no longer within the flags, and they're telling you to get back in, because without you realizing it, the tide has pulled you where it wanted to go, not where you wanted to go. And that is just the nature of swimming in a tide. And so today's reading introduces us, this chapter 1, verse 1 to 5, we are introduced to Elimelech's family. Elimelech is the father, we've got Naomi is the mom, and then they've got 2 kids. And it's a family struggling in a famine, caught in crisis, choosing to take matters into their own hands. Just like me making my way across the Buffalo River, kicking and flailing about, they enjoy that same agency, that same ability to act and to choose, but we will see that they are ultimately swimming in God's tide. And while their actions move their situation from bad to worse, God's faithfulness is unwavering. And as the weeks unfold, as we go through Ruth, we'll ultimately see that they are being swept along in God's tide, whether they realize it or not, and how God's purposes are ultimately actually accomplished through this family for the nation of Israel, and ultimately for all people, including us. So let's read the first 5 verses of Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife is Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. So the opening portion of this book is packed with some clues that help us understand the story better. First of all, verse 1, we learn that the story is set in the time of Judges. You might have actually noticed that the book of Ruth follows on from the book of Judges immediately in our Bibles. And some of the commentary I've read suggests that Judges gives us a sort of macro perspective on the state of Israel, while the book of Ruth zooms in and gives us a personalized experience just looking at this one family and their life. And so that's maybe a helpful way to think about some of the things that Ruth adds to the canon, or the role it plays in the greater canon of Scripture, giving us this picture of one family compared to the big picture from books like Judges. So what do we know about the time of Judges and Israel in that time of people like Samson and Deborah and Gideon, Othniel, donkeys' jawbones, wine presses? We know that Israel lived in this perpetual, seemingly, cycle of initial peace, then a generation that is unfaithful to the Lord, inevitable oppression and judgment, and then, at their lowest point, crying out to God for restoration, and then God sending one of these judges, and then a period of peace, and rinse and repeat. They're living in the promised land, but every second generation or so seems to slip into waywardness and unfaithfulness and idol worship until God intervenes, until God's faithfulness comes to the fore. Let's keep going. Second half of verse 1, there was a famine in the land. Which land? Well, the promised land, right? The land that's supposed to be flowing with milk and honey. The land that produced a bunch of grapes so big that 2 men have to carry it out on the original reconnaissance mission. What did God promise Israel before they entered the land? We read in Deuteronomy 8, it says, "Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks and streams and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates and olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing." And yet the land is living clearly under the judgment of God. The good land that God promised has seized up and is no longer fruitful, and it creates a crisis for Elimelech's family. And so what do? Do they remember the promise of plenty and of flowing rivers, of God's provision to his people if they are to be obedient? Do they remember what it took to get them into the land in the first place? The exodus and the time in the desert and the many victories and the clearing out of the people that are there? No. They just go to Moab. They pack up, they take what they've got, and they go and they live in Moab. They take matters into their own hands. And they go and live in an enemy land. The 2 sons marry Moabite women. And they likely, in that, embracing Moabite culture and worship. And then Elimelech dies, and so do both of the sons. Things go from bad to worse. Naomi had little when she left with her family. And now she finds herself in a foreign land, among a foreign people, as a widow, with seemingly no hope of recovery, certainly by her read of the situation. And so this family becomes a portrait of Israel, a family that had lost its way and chosen to walk away from God's promises. I also don't want us to read the passage and simply confine it to like a mental exercise, reading about this ancient family in this, very different time and place. We all know what it's like to feel crisis in our lives. It might be your crumbling career prospects. It might be your marriage. It might be a period, it might be just singleness that's getting to you. It could be a breakdown of relationship in your family or financial stress. Are you feeling tempted to pack your bags and head for Moab, like Elimelech's family? Maybe your last few decisions have unleashed consequences in your life that make the original situation seem tame by comparison. And I'm not suggesting that we downplay the challenges that we face, as if they are not consequential. Elimelech needed to put food on the table. The crises that we face are not necessarily of our own making either. We aren't privy to all the options that Elimelech had available to him, but we can see and surmise that not everyone left Canaan. Some chose to stay in the land and trust that God's promises would hold and would prevail ultimately. Okay, the if we look at the book of Judges, the last chapter, the last verse of the book of Judges, chapter 21, verse 25 says, "In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit." A wayward people, the people of God, wayward and without a king. If you jump ahead to Matthew 1 and we read the opening genealogy, which ultimately is the genealogy of Christ, we see verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And as we know, David, the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus. And so because of the Creator's grace, the tide of God is unstoppable and continues to flow. And despite Elimelech's lack of faith and his decision to go and all the decisions that follow that, and through some very unlikely characters, including Ruth the Moabite, who ends up in the genealogy of King David as his great-great-grandmother and ultimately of Christ, God's providence is at work. Because God knows what his people need. They need to come back to him in obedience. They need a good king. They need redemption. And so the promise of the story, and I'm really just giving a sort of broad frame today for this. The promise of the story that we will discover as we go through it week to week, is whether we keep our side of the bargain or not, God remains resolutely faithful. And not only is there always a way back from Moab, but he is already at work in our lives to provide for us and to restore us. And I think this book, I hope this book really raises our view of God's providence in our lives. And it is the promise. Like, if you feel like you're actually sitting in Moab at the moment, and you're wondering how you ended up here, and whether or not there is a way back, the story of Ruth is that God's providence is going to prevail come what may in our lives. Whatever actions we take, us flailing in the water, as God's people, as it was for Ruth and her family, as it was for Israel, so it is for us today. That God will ultimately achieve his purposes in our lives, but also in the wider perspective, in the wider arc of redemptive history. And so we'll end it there today. We've got some discussion points just to help us think about the context these guys are in, think about the story, trying to sort of feel it a bit more, put ourselves in that position. But yeah, I'm trusting that this will be a series that really helps us think with a big view about who God is, how we fit in, and the security we have, despite ourselves sometimes, in our relationship with him. Great. We'll see you on Thursday. Cheers.